Dr. Craig, you always keep an eye on culture and what's being influential in culture. And one of the real popularizers of science these days is Neil deGrasse Tyson, the renewed and revived Cosmos TV show. And he is really busy these days speaking and being interviewed. A couple of comments here that I think are relevant to your work that we'll have you listen to and get your comments on as he talks about God and science, whether he believes in God. And he's asked first here what he says to people who believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old.
Speaking of earth, how do you feel about the people that think it's only 6,000 years old?
If they think that because that is mandated by their religious philosophy.
Exactly.
Okay. Just keep it out of the science classroom. That's all. I don't try to confuse that with doing science. Science, we have learned. Science has completely transformed our culture. It's doubled our life expectancy. It has brought comfort and health and well-being. And not only science, but the fruits of science, the technological fruits of science. And of course, you need to be good shepherds of this power because in the wrong hands, it could be used for evil. All right? This is the great sort of dichotomy of unlocking the secrets of nature. Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to fight them to tell them the universe is not
just 6,000 years. Your way.
No, not my, just the science classroom.
Right.
No, and if you want to put it in the science classroom, understand the ramifications.
Right.
Your country will go bankrupt because you will no longer be in a position to forge the economies of tomorrow that will require science and technological innovation.
At least.
First thing that comes up, Dr. Craig, is that they're interacting with only one aspect of what some Christians believe, and that is a young earth creation. They haven't interacted with historically many Christian scholars and others who've held that Yom allows for an old universe.
Well, I wonder, Kevin, is this a result of they're setting up straw men that are easy to knock down, or is it rather a manifestation of the incredible cultural influence of young earth creationism in the evangelical church? I'm not sure which, but you're certainly right in saying that they're fighting, or he's fighting here, a minority position that doesn't represent the range of views held by evangelical Christians as well as other types of Christians.
And he says, believe what you want, just keep it out of the classroom.
Yeah, I think this is odd that he should be bringing this up because that's not an issue in this country anymore. The courts have mandated that creationism cannot be taught in public school classrooms. So I don't see that that's an issue. He's beating a dead horse there. I thought it was odd when he started bringing in the fact that science can be used for evil. That's certainly true. Atomic weapons or weapons of mass destructions in the hands of evil people can be used for horrible ends, as we've seen in various places around the world. But what that has to do with whether or not young earth creationism is taught in the classroom is unclear to me.
And he brings up what we hear a lot from professional scientists, and that is our economy is going to suffer if we don't keep up with the rest of the world. If we're a bunch of outdated people believing in a young earth and all that, we're going to be behind the rest of the world.
Yeah,
I hear that all the time.
I don't know. I would love to know on what basis he makes that sociological prediction, especially if, say, young earth creationism were taught as one option among many alternatives, say, in the science classroom, which isn't going to happen anyway. As I say, it's been ruled unconstitutional. But if it were, it's far from clear to me that this would lead to economic depression and bankruptcy in the United States. I think this is hyperbole, frankly.
He really does try to distinguish the two realms, doesn't he? If you want to do that, go ahead and have that belief, but it's not fact.
Well, that is interesting. He said it's due to their religious philosophy, was the way he put it. And I think young earth creationists would agree with that. They would say that this is a theological position that we adopt on the basis of the teaching of Scripture, and then we try to craft a model of the universe and of Earth's origins and the development of life that would be consistent with that theological perspective. So young Earth creationists don't claim that they read their views off of the scientific evidence. Rather, they would say we have theological grounds for believing as we do, and that then one will develop a theory of the world that will be consistent both with that commitment and then also with the scientific evidence. Now, I think it's doubtful that they can successfully do that, as you know, but that would be the way they would describe their project.
Let's continue with some audio.
The next question, because a few people on the lines are asking, do you believe in God?
I'm not convinced. If here's the thing, if every time I talk about God with someone who's a believer, God is all powerful and all knowing and all good, right? The good is a big part of this. Mm-hmm. And then I look at all the ways Earth wants to kill us.
Strangle
A
us.
tsunami takes out 250,000 people, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, and I add all of that up. Either the God is not all powerful or is not all good. But it can't really be both, given all the ways the universe wants to kill us. And if Earth is not finished killing you, there's the asteroid that could come in.
Right.
An asteroid rendered 70% of all life forms extinct. Back in the famous one in 65 million years ago that took out the dinosaurs. So there's so many ways to die, not at the hands of someone else who has free will, that I don't know what is the nature of the God that you're talking about.
I gotta try to use your logic back at you.
Uh-huh.
But don't we define what is good and what is bad? So we see a tsunami wipe out a whole bunch of people, and we're as human beings going, wow, that's bad, because we define what bad is. Maybe in God's brain, eyes, whatever the hell, that's not bad.
Well, but except you defined what God is.
Oh boy.
Let's stop there. When asked if he believes in God, he seems to take a more agnostic position. And
He's
says-
not convinced,
not
which
convinced.
is an agnostic, not atheist position.
But then immediately goes to, well, if there is a God, why on earth is this earth such a dangerous place?
Right. And he enunciates, Kevin, you notice, a version of the logical problem of evil based upon so-called natural evil in the world, the suffering that results from natural disasters. And I think it's pretty clear from his remarks on free will that he does that so as to circumvent the free will defense with respect to the problem of evil. But what our listeners, I think, need to understand is that this version of the problem of evil, that it is impossible for God to be all powerful and all good, is rejected by virtually everyone today, both theist and non-theist, because it lays upon the non-theist so heavy a burden of proof that nobody's been able to sustain it. The non-theist would have to show that it is impossible, logically, that God could have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world that's due to natural disasters. And there's simply no way that the non-theist can justify such a claim. He can say, as Tyson does, well, I don't see why these things would occur, but that doesn't even take one step toward proving that it is logically impossible that God could have morally sufficient reasons for allowing these disasters to occur.
He says something at the end that I want to listen to again.
Who has free will. That I don't know what is the nature of the God that you're talking about.
I gotta try to use your logic back at you.
Uh-huh.
But don't we define what is good and what is bad? So we see a tsunami wipe out a whole bunch of people, and we're as human beings going, wow, that's bad, because we define what bad is. Maybe in God's brain, eyes, whatever the hell, that's not bad.
Well, but except you defined what God is.
Oh boy. Wow.
Now you did it.
That's
So why do you have the power to define who and what
Well,
God is
Right.
but not have the power to define what good is.
Am I-
So he's saying there, well, he tries to head off the typical answer that theists give, and that is, how do you know that this isn't ultimately for our good? Because we determine, as naturalists, what the good is, and what people determine what it is.
Well, I think that the interviewer is raising a very good question here, namely, on naturalism, on what basis do you say something like this disaster is good or bad? Take the tsunami which sweeps across a South Pacific island, carrying its population into the ocean. Now, as my colleague Doug Guyvett has pointed out, this would be very bad for the people living on the island, but it would be a great boon for the marine life surrounding the island
Fish would love it.
to have such a feast. So, on the naturalist basis, what meaning is there to speak of good or bad with respect to these disasters? And what Guyvett points out is that when we say that these things are bad, we are saying they ought not to happen. These things ought not to be. But when you say that, you are presupposing there is a way things ought to be. And this isn't it. But if there's a way that things ought to be, that means there's some sort of design plan for the universe and for the earth that these things are or are not fulfilling. And you can't have a design plan unless you have a designer. So when the naturalist claims that these things are bad, that these things ought not to be, he's implicitly, I think, assuming there is some kind of a designer, some sort of a standard against which these things can be measured. So I think that the interviewer is actually making a very good point here with respect to natural evil. Now, Tyson tries to change the subject. This is so typical when confronted with a difficult objection. One changes the subject so as to avoid the objection, says, well, define what God is. Well, he's already defined it for us. He says God is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing being, who presumably has created the world. So there's not a problem of defining God. And that gambit there at the end about if you can't define God, what was it? If you can't define what is good, then how can you define God? Well, that's just very easy. Even the naturalist can understand what we're talking about when he says God does or does not exist. And the question isn't defining good. That's a question of the English language and looking up the meaning in a dictionary. The question, rather, for the naturalist is why think that tsunamis are bad rather than good. As I said, it's difficult on naturalism to make those kinds of judgments because there is no design plan according to which the universe is developing.
Continue with the audio.
What is it? We just don't know it all. Not even
Oh,
close.
sure. So therefore, if you're going to say God actually is good, and 250,000 people dying from an earthquake and a tsunami and other natural disasters, and God presumably has control over that, and God is good, then we have to then say God works in mysterious ways, right?
There you go.
That's that. But people only say that when their understanding of God fails them.
When
right?
it's something bad.
No, when they can't understand it, they say, well, God works in mysterious ways. But somehow, in these other ways, you did understand him.
Right.
How are you saying, well, this is the handiwork of God? This you doing God's work. God wants you to do this. Somehow you know God's motives every other way. When 250,000 people get wiped out, God works in mysterious ways. Why do you even claim to have access to God's mind in some contexts and not others?
Exactly.
Just admit you have no clue and get on with life.
He really gets excited, doesn't he?
Yes, and again, notice here, rather than respond to the objection, there's the attempt to shift the burden of proof to the theist's shoulders. Remember I said the atheist is the one here who is making the claim that it's logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting these things. That's the atheist's burden of proof, to show that there cannot be a morally sufficient reasons for these. And it's no response to that objection to say, well, but you theists claim to know what he's doing in other cases. All that would suggest is that theists should be equally skeptical about knowing what God is doing in these other cases. It does nothing to show what the atheist needs to show, that God cannot have morally sufficient reasons for allowing these disasters to occur. And in fact, I think from the examples he gives that he's again mixing apples and oranges. When something good happens, the theist doesn't, I think, necessarily say, I know that God did it for this reason. How do you know what reason he did it for? The reason might not emerge until hundreds of years from now through the reverberation this event sends through human history. We can be thankful for the good things that happen, but I don't think any informed theist would be so presumptuous as to think that we know all of the reasons for which God permits things to happen, whether good or bad, because these are simply beyond our scope of knowledge as finite creatures, limited in time and space and in intelligence and insight. But that doesn't mean, for example, that you can't have good arguments for the existence of God from the origin of the universe or from the fine-tuning of the universe, because in that case, you're not trying to read God's mind, as Tyson puts it. Rather, you are making an inference from certain effects to an explanation of those effects. But you're not making guesses about the motivation of God or trying to read his mind. So I would simply say that in going through life, we don't have the ability to make any kind of guesses about why things happen in the world. We're just not in a position to make those kind of judgments. Rather, our responsibility, I think, as the book of Job emphasizes, is to trust God and live faithfully for him through the circumstances that we go through. Maybe someday in heaven, looking back, we'll see the reason for why good and bad things occurred. But while we're here in the midst of life, that knowledge is simply not within our grasp.
Dr. Craig, I really want our listeners to get this, because I hear this complaint from our non-theist friends all the time. It's number one on the chart, almost.
Really?
That is, they are very irked by the reply, well, God works in mysterious ways. I can't tell you.
I don't hear Christians putting it that way. That sounds like a cop-out. What William Alston says is that due to our inherent cognitive limitations, we're not in a position to make probability judgments with any sort of confidence that this or that event could not have been justly permitted by God. And that, I think, is absolutely true. Think of our limits in time and space. We have no idea of what the reverberations might be in future history of some event that occurs, like, say, your daughter being run over by a drunk driver. God's morally sufficient reason for allowing that tragedy to occur might not emerge until centuries from now, or in ways utterly unanticipated by us. And so just our limits in time and space make it impossible for us to make the kind of judgment that the atheist wants to make. And you can call that God works in mysterious ways, but that's not some sort of irrational statement. That's based upon very real cognitive limitations that make it impossible to make the kind of judgments that the atheist wants to make. Remember, he's the one who has the burden of proof here to show that God cannot have morally sufficient reasons for allowing this or that to occur.
So we should clarify a little when we say God works in mysterious ways.
Or not say it at all.
Not say it at all, yeah.
I think that Christians typically don't say that. I think that is like the phrase, the God of the gaps. It's a phrase that unbelievers use to describe Christian positions in emotionally pejorative language.
Let's continue with some audio.
That's how I look at it.
We just don't have a clue when it comes down to it.
Well, I'd like to think that preserving health and longevity, that is a nice operational definition of something that's good.
Right.
How can you how can you debate something that keeps you alive and healthy?
Okay, stop.
That's got to be something.
I mean, that health and human longevity defines the good. There's absolutely no reason to think that that's true. Why would the health and longevity of this little species down here on this planet Earth on naturalism constitute the good? I don't see any reason on naturalism to think that that's true.
Well, there's a group in Northern California that wants to see human beings go extinct because we mess up the planet.
Yeah.
So our health and longevity is not a good thing for them.
And you know, this really does have sinister implications, this kind of ethic. Suppose that through some fluke of history, the reverberations of an event through history, that the rape and murder of a little girl would result in greater health and longevity for the human race as a whole. Then on this kind of ethic, not only would that event be good, but you'd be morally obligated to rape and murder her in order to bring about this great good of humanity. I just see no reason at all to think that the good is what promotes health and longevity for human beings.
Okay, let's see where I was at.
Every other way, when 250,000 people get wiped out, God works in mysterious ways.
Too far back.
Just called you an atheist and you had to respond to it.
How can you debate something that keeps you alive and healthy?
I'll cut that.
That's got to be something that's good. I can't. I refuse to allow someone to say, "I'm going to give you cancer, birth defects, and shorten your life," and somehow call that good. I'm not going.
Oh, I hear you.
I'm not going there.
You call yourself an agnostic.
Now,
and
wait a
I know-
minute, Kevin. He seems to think that if God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing something to occur, that makes the thing good. And I don't think that follows at all. He's assuming that what ought not to be permitted. And that doesn't follow. I think that there can be cases in which one permits evil or suffering to take place, because even though that event is evil or bad, there can be some greater good that would come out of it, or the prevention of some even worse evil in the future. And as Christians, we believe there is a provident God who guides human history in such a way that his good purposes will be achieved. And I would say, Kevin, that contrary to what deGrasse Tyson assumes, that ultimate good is not going to be realized in some earthly way. Ultimately, God's purpose is to bring as many people as he can freely into his kingdom, where they will find eternal life and infinite happiness. And it may well be the case that only in a world that is permeated with natural evil and suffering would that great good be realized.
Clarify for us, any of us who may be thinking, well, the ends don't justify the means. So, but permitting something is not the same as promoting or causing something.
Right, that's obvious. I mean, we will sometimes permit something. Say that you've got a choice between either allowing one person to be shot and killed or 3 people to be shot and killed, and you can't do both. You can only prevent one. Well, if you prevent the 3 people being shot and killed, you've permitted the one person to be killed. But that doesn't mean you've done something evil.
Is one of them a lawyer? Okay, wait a minute. Anyway, so all right, so we're getting the different, we're getting the nuances there. Permitting evil. Let's continue with his thoughts.
You didn't go into this. It seems like on your Wikipedia page, the public first just called you an atheist and you had to respond to it. And I know you've spoken about this before, but why is the distinction important to you, especially as a public figure?
I'm not so much concerned with the definition, the formal definition of the word atheist and the formal definition of the word agnostic. What concerns me is the behavior of people call themselves those words, because that becomes the definition of the word. Of course, the dictionary really doesn't define words. It describes the words as they are used in society. And hence you have the evolution of words in the English language. So when I see people who say they are atheists and the energy that they invest in that fact, that's just simply not me. There's got to be some other word for someone who really just simply doesn't care on that level. And so agnostic seemed to be something a little more accurate given my actual behavior in the presence of these philosophies. I don't like labels because it's an excuse for not actually thinking about the thoughts that the other person has.
Right.
And it ignores what might be nuances or information that lingers at the boundary of the parameters that the other person defines for that category. So the only ist that I am is a scientist, and the only ism that I don't even think I'm an ism. But the people who see a few things that I'll say or do, and they say, oh, he's a this or he's a that, and then label it. And I'm thinking, like, what are you doing? And not only that, if you look carefully at the arguments I've given, most of them now are just scattered all over YouTube. But if you actually listen carefully, I'm at no point expressing an opinion. It may feel that way because I think I have a lot of sort of energy when I'm in front of an audience. But it's not about my opinion. It's about sort of what is going on in life.
He says here that agnostic best describes him, and that words can be in flux, that definitions we find in the dictionary may or may not reflect the usage that is going on among people now.
Well, it's certainly true that language evolves. We all know that. But nevertheless, words do have meaning according to those that natural or native language users use. And I think it would be accurate to say his view is agnosticism, not atheism. He is not claiming that God does not exist. He's just saying, I'm not convinced. And as for labels, labels are very useful in helping us to understand each other. Labels are vital when you go to the grocery store and want to know what's in the can. If it says pickles rather than ketchup, that's really important for you to know what you're getting. And so labels are important when a person says to you, I am a Muslim, or I am a Christian, or I am a Hindu. That helps us to understand where he's coming from. So descriptive labels are very useful, and we don't need to label one another. We can label ourselves and tell others descriptively via labels what we believe. So there's nothing the matter with using labels insofar as they are correct descriptions of what's there.
And he says, I really don't care much about this. I'm a scientist, and I'm not out to give my opinion. And so do you get from that, Dr. Craig, that he's saying, I'm going to deal in the factual world, and you guys can be over here in the opinion world all you want. That's where religion belongs.
I don't know. I wondered about that when he said, I mean, he says I'm a scientist, that's a label, right? I'm not a golfer, I'm not a dancer, I'm not a philosopher, I'm a scientist.
You guys can have all your labels.
Label.
I'm a scientist. Y'all can be labeled all day.
So, I mean, he uses a label to describe who he is, which is fine. But then he says, I don't have any opinions, when he just told us a few moments ago that God cannot be all-powerful, all-good, and all-knowing, and yet there be the suffering in the world. That was certainly an opinion. Everything he says that's an assertion is presumably an opinion that he holds to.
Well, surely he must get that, so he must mean something along the lines of science deals in facts, not opinions, and all you religious people, and since we're in this, talking about this topic right now of God, well, I'm not here to give my opinion.
I understand what you're saying, Kevin, though it didn't sound to me like that was what he was saying.
Okay.
Otherwise, we would expect some sort of scientific proof for example, the claim that God and evil are incompatible with each other, whereas he didn't give any sort of argument for that, much less a scientific argument. So if he claims he has no opinions but is merely stating scientific facts, then my goodness, he's got a lot of evidence to provide for all of the assertions that he's made.
Let's continue and see what he says.
I think the most viewed among YouTubes that I've put out there that people associate with atheism or religion or spirituality was my presentation at the Beyond Belief conference in 2006. This was in San Diego. And we talked about intelligent design. It was freshly in the news because of the Dover, Pennsylvania case. I simply said that intelligent design, if you think of it as someone reaching the limits of their knowledge and then invoking the hand of something more intelligent than they, historically that simply would have been God, there's plenty of precedent for that among the world's most famous scientists throughout history. So it's not a new thought to think that God has something to do with the universe beyond the understanding that humans have been able to muster. So part of the talk was to present that fact and not sweep it under the rug, and then just say that intelligent design, since it embraces the ignorance beyond beyond your limits of understanding, it cannot possibly, expressed that way, it cannot possibly serve a philosophy of discovery, which is what science is about.
Okay,
Can't
stopping there.
serve what?
Service the process of discovery. He says that he talked about two things there concerning intelligent design. One is that scientists in history have always invoked God when they kind of get to the limits of their understanding. But then he comes back and says, but that's also a conversation stopper, a science stopper, in a sense of once you invoke God, then you have stifled discovery.
Yes, that's the assertion. Unfortunately, not having heard his original talk, we don't know what justification he would give for these assertions. I think he has caricatured intelligent design. I know the works of people who are in that movement, and people like William Dembski, in his book The Design Inference, published by Cambridge University Press, offers a principled justification to inferring design. Dembski points out that we make design inferences all the time in life. As deGrasse Tyson said, what's going on in life? In determining on a crime scene that a fire is the result of arson rather than an accident. In detecting cases of plagiarism as opposed to just an accidental coincidence. In cryptography, where we decode something that looks like gibberish to find an intelligent message in it. In insurance fraud, where the insurance investigator determines that something was actually deliberate rather than just by chance. We make design inferences all the time. And what Dembski tries to do in this book is to lay out a very principled way in which one can justifiably make a design inference. And then the claim of these folks who apply it to biology is that in biology, this principled inference pattern will yield the inference to some sort of intelligence behind the biological complexity in the world. So it is not just a sort of God of the gaps invoking something because we've reached the bounds of our knowledge. Rather, it's a principled inference following a familiar pattern of reasoning that we use all the time in life. Now, maybe the ID theorists are wrong about this, but if so, that needs to be shown. You can't just caricature them by failing to come to grips with their model of design inferences.
He says something, Bill, as well, that is worth commenting on. He complains that in the world of YouTube and social media, that you can be portrayed a certain way based on what is most often placed out there on YouTube. And he says, there's a big percentage of YouTube videos about me that just deal in what I said about intelligent design. And he says, the atheist community wants to own me. And in fact, they keep going to his Wikipedia and changing that he's an atheist.
Really?
When he claims to be an agnostic, and he's saying, quit it, you know. And so, anyway, that's one of the phenomena we find in social media today, that what's out there on YouTube is not necessarily representative of the full body of your work, but may just...
Yes, I've experienced that myself. I'm constantly amazed at how folks have only seen these popular level debates that I've engaged in, and they've never bothered to read any of my published work, much less the scholarly published work that is in peer-reviewed journals or with academic presses. So I can understand his complaint.
Let's wrap up the audio then from Dr. Tyson.
Science is about taking the unknown and figuring it out. Intelligent design, as presented in the Dover trial and as is widely discussed, takes what is unknown and then doesn't try to figure it out. It says we can't figure it out and ascribes it to a higher intelligence.
Yeah, see, that's a caricature. That's a caricature of his own invention. I would challenge him to cite supporting passages for us from the books of intelligent design theorists like Michael Behe, William Dembski, Stephen Meyer, Michael Denton. You can't get away with making these kinds of caricatures unless you're prepared to give citations from the works of these people that support the portrayal that you're offering of them. I think that this is a straw man that doesn't accurately represent the work of these theorists, whether you agree with them or not. Part of scholarly responsibility is to represent accurately the views of your opponents.
Well, it certainly wasn't very generous, and he even tried to qualify it by saying, as it was presented at the trial and as people commonly use it. Well, if you're familiar with the works of Behe and Dembski and Richards and so on, and Johnson, then you're going to know a lot more than what was covered in the press at the trial.
Sure.
And so that would be a caricature and not representing the view very well.
All I said was, it's not science. Therefore, it does not belong in the science classroom. You want to put it somewhere, it's fine. Put it in philosophy class or history class or religion class. It's not science. That entire argument, which summarizes the 30-minute talk, does not contain an opinion. There's not an opinion there. Science is about discovery. Intelligent design doesn't lead to discovery. It is not science. It's not an opinion. Period. So people said, oh, he's an atheist. Let's make him an atheist. And they put it in my wiki page. I was fascinated by that. And I said, well, no, I'm not really that. I'm more agnostic. Changed it back to atheist. And so what intrigues me is the urge to claim me in the movement when I don't even write about this stuff.
Right.
And in fact, the extent to which I have addressed it occupies maybe 1.5% of my total speeches and writings, maybe 1.5%, and it's 8.5% the universe. But what happens is these bits get clipped, put on YouTube, and that's what people gravitate to. So if you do the YouTube statistics of my output, it looks like I'm 40% arguing about intelligent design.
Right.
When I just don't care. I just keep it out of the science classroom. What you do with it after that, I don't have the time, the interest, the energy to fight it. You're not going to see me debating religious people. You're not going to see me marching. You're not going to see me picketing. I'd rather just get people thinking accurately and honestly from the get-go. And what they do with their mind after that is their business.
Poor Neil, he's got a PR problem.
Well, once again, you have this expression that I don't have any opinions, where he's just offered his opinion that intelligent design is not science because it doesn't aid discovery. Now, how is that not an opinion? Even if it's true, it's still his opinion, and it's one that's, I think, disputable. The caricature of ID that he's offered might not be science, but ID theorists have tried to show how intelligent design can yield testable predictions that would be very different from the standard neo-Darwinian model of biological evolution. So he's just not interacting responsibly with the material on the other side. Besides that, Kevin, notice that he is happy to have intelligent design debated in the philosophy class, the history class, or the religion class. Now, I'd be very happy with that. As a philosopher, that's where I would want to see them discussed as well. Intelligent design theorists do claim that what they're doing is part of science. But I see that as really just a kind of corollary of intelligent design. The inference to an intelligent designer, I would be very happy with characterizing as a philosophical inference, and that therefore this belongs in the philosophy class. I don't think of myself as offering a different scientific theory when I say that God is the best explanation, say, for the fine-tuning of the universe. It's the same theory, but I would just use that as support for a premise in a philosophical argument leading to a conclusion that has theological significance.